Hi, I'm Ted Haptegaber, founder and producer of Live Talks Los Angeles. Thanks for joining us. Since we started over a decade ago, we have brought you hundreds of conversations with storytellers, writers, actors, musicians, humorists, chefs, and thought leaders in business and science. You can watch and hear most of these in our YouTube channel and our podcast. For details, visit livetalksla.org. And now, here's the show you've tuned in to see.
I think I can probably speak for everyone in the room when I say that we are so excited to spend this evening with you discussing your new book, The Backyard Bird Chronicles. And as an ornithologist, I was particularly delighted to see this book be released. I think for me, this was, this combination of birds and art that is so robust. It has a really rich history, and you're adding to that conversation, and you're welcoming your readers into a new perspective on the world of birds. And so I would be curious to hear about your background. So starting back in childhood, you had this interest in birds, interest in all of nature, and you speak about this at the beginning of the book, and also an interest in illustration, in sketching and drawing what you saw. So I'd be curious to hear more about this background.
I grew up mostly in suburbs, so there wasn't a lot of chance to go to parks or anything like that. My parents worked 7 days a week, basically. But there was one period of 3 years where I lived about a block away from a creek. And I would climb down into that creek almost every day and explore. And most of the creatures I saw were those that were on the ground because I was nearsighted. And there were snakes and frogs and tadpoles, in a pool that dried up and then they were dead. There were lizards where the tails came off. There were bugs. And there were birds, but they were black birds, and I'm sure they were escapees from the movie The Birds. So I didn't see birds that much because I was nearsighted, and also I thought of them as dangerous. I loved to draw as a kid. Part of what I loved is the solitude of being in my own room, being away from family chaos. That's why I love the creek as well. And then just spending hours drawing. There was no chance I would ever grow up to be an artist, however, because I was made to believe that was a guaranteed path to homelessness, or what they called then, I think, hobos and bums. And so, I was not going to follow in that direction. And also, I had a teacher when I was 16 who said I had no imagination. He was my art teacher, and said no imagination, which is necessary to a deeper creative level. So there you go. Thank God I didn't become a fiction writer.
And that complete lack of imagination is absolutely seen through the remarkable book that you've just produced. The amazing cartoon-like sketches that fill these pages, that bring these birds to life. You endow them with what Sibley in the foreword describes as characters. They feel like characters in your novels. Yeah. So could you talk with us a little bit about how these living beings, these wild creatures, end up taking on personalities beyond themselves?
I was somebody who loved art. I was somebody who played in the creek all day long, and I loved animals. I also had what I would consider an observer's mind, which feeds into the fact that I'm a novelist. I could stare at things for hours and hours and hours. I stared once when I was in Easter Island at ants coming out of a sidewalk crack. What person would not go see all the sights of Easter Island and would instead spend 3 hours looking at ants? But that's the kind of thing that fascinates me. So birds are there, and suddenly I discovered that these birds see me, and they might have been eating suet, you know, staying on the suet and pecking at it, or they might have been in the bath bathing or drinking, and they would look up and look right at me. And then they would go back to doing what they were doing. And the fact that they went back to doing it was, to me, the start of a relationship. Now, by that I don't mean we were friends. I think what it meant was that at that moment, and possibly for the future, the bird was not so frightened of me that it would fly off. It kind of accepted me as part of its world, just as it was part of mine. But again, I may have loved the bird, but it did not love me.
Yeah.
Never brought me any suet or anything like that.
An unfailingly disappointing characteristic of birds is they just don't bring you as much suet as you bring them, right?
And they were like characters, because
Yeah.
what I would notice is that they would do all these interesting behaviors. You know, if you only look at them momentarily, they're just birds, and they drink and they take off. They eat, they take off. But if you watch them for a while, there are these dramas that happen. There's conflicts. There's conflicts with other birds. There's, you know, group decisions about whether to flee, or, and so I started noticing this. After a while, I saw repeated behaviors and patterns, and that's what interested me the most.
Yeah, talking about those repeated behaviors, one of the most kind of spectacularly narrated sets of birds in your book are the California scrub jays. And these are birds
naughty birds.
Yeah, they're naughty, right? They often are the socially dominant bird at a feeder. Yeah. They are also incredibly intelligent.
Smartest bird in the yard.
Yeah. Smartest bird in the yard. Yeah. But I won't tell that to any raven that stops by your yard. Yeah.
You don't get too many ravens, so they're not offended.
Right. And so, thinking about California scrub jays, what role do they play in kind of the social melee in your yard?
Well, first, you all should know that Sean here has studied jays, Canada jays, but they're pretty similar. So he knows a lot about the kind of things that I observed as an amateur. One of the qualities is that they're very persistent. And when you think about intelligence, I started looking at the traits that these birds have. So birds have certain skills, you know, in their natural environment, whether they poke with their bill into a crevice or hang onto things with their feet and things. And I would see them apply this to feeders that I had made. So one time I had this cage, and it was to exclude them. And it had a little bowl in the middle with suet, this very soft suet, you know, the best kind with the insect heads and the antenna and all of that, very nutritious. And it was trying to get to it, but if a scrub jay got it, it would have been gone like in 5 minutes. So I put it in the middle of this square cage I made that had openings, grid openings, little birds can get into. Well, it found a way to push the bowl to the side, so then it could eat the food. So I put it on a silicone pad so it couldn't slide it over. The next day I saw there was a lot of silicone confetti on the flagstone. And the bowl was off to the side and completely empty. So then I started wrapping twigs around all the sides so it couldn't get its, you know, bill in that far. The next day all the twigs were on the ground. I put dowels up there. The next day the dowels were sawed in half. I ended up getting bricks. And I put bricks all around the bowl. And it was like, Amy 1, scrub jay 0. And then I noticed the next day the scrub jay had put its entire head through one of these small openings. You know, the openings are only about 1.5 inches square. And you know how big a scrub jay is. I mean, you'd think the skull would be far bigger than that. Whole head in there, so it's like this. And I tried to think to myself, what kind of risk assessment did it do to that kind of maneuver where it could be attacked this way? Because couldn't easily pull its head out or attack from behind, not just by a little bird, but another scrub jay.
Sure.
You know,
yeah.
for example. And so this is either intelligence or stupidity. But I was just fascinated by the combination of skills they would use, and also this nature of persistence, which I think is part of intelligence in a way in the animal world.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, persistence and also a willingness to explore novel objects in the environment. A willingness to not be afraid, but to say this thing that is odd, that maybe I've never encountered before, enables the opportunity to acquire food, or maybe it's simply an interesting play thing. You see a lot of play in the animal kingdom. That's often highly correlated with this intelligence.
Now, you said they're pretty interested in new things, and I thought, I've seen ravens. We don't get I've seen them in other places. They seem kind of spooked by new things. Yeah. Do you find that to be true?
Yes.
Yes. So the ravens are spooked, but the scrub jays are not.
Yeah.
And they're corvids, but you know, they somehow can explore things without being spooked. You know, the ravens will jump up. They do jumping jacks. They'll get close to something and they'll do jumping jacks. Like they're scared and they want to make sure that thing's not going to jump at them. But scrub jays are, so maybe part of their smarts is that they are curious.
Yeah.
And that overrides fear or something.
Right.
Which enables them to survive better because they can take advantage of things. Yeah. And one of the things that I discovered watching birds is that almost everything they do, the way they're put together as well, is geared toward survival. Every single day is a chance for them to survive. So all the things you do, the smarts, how they get food, when they look for things, looking at enemies, looking up, I just realized the smarts are geared toward survival, not reading, not playing games with humans. It's just about survival.
Yeah. Yeah, and this is it's kind of a theme throughout evolutionary biology and ecological study, is this idea of fitness, of passing one's genes on to the next generation. Yeah. And different species explore that dynamic in different ways. You know, some of them specialize in a certain kind of habitat, and these habitat specialists are not very flexible in their habits. They're not wanting to explore novel objects in their environment. And as long as the habitat is stable, then they are the very, very best at accessing that resource, the very best at
different
surviving.
Or something like that. So if something is more stable like that, like my backyard. Yeah. My backyard is mostly oak trees, and there's an area that has a floral succulent garden and a rooftop that's green as well. But that's really interesting to see what the conditions, the ecological conditions must also be. So I would see differences in how they behaved, for example, during those big storms that came and were relentless. Right. How would that change their behavior? Or when we had smoke from the wildfires, how did that change their behavior? Or what birds came and what did they do when they came? Right. You know, all of these changes that I was experiencing, but then I wondered how the birds were experiencing. Yeah. I could go in the house and have an air filter, but they couldn't.
Yeah, yeah, and you read about this really powerfully with watching a Buick's wren come to drink in your yard during the campfire wildfires in November 2018, and worrying for its safety while you can retreat into the home.
I worried about a lot of the birds, and I would go out at several times during the day to empty the water to make sure that they had clean water. Of course, it was dirty within 5 minutes, but just trying to protect these birds as much as possible, because obviously they'd flown in. All they did, these birds that came, all they did was bathe and drink. Yeah. And that's so absolutely necessary for birds. They have to bathe and drink every day.
Yeah, yeah. This experience of watching birds contend with smoky air or a changing environment, how do you think that watching birds in your backyard led you into these kind of broader global concepts of changes that are impacting birds?
Well, it's like what you talked about, that you're looking at the birds in terms of a habitat. And when you see that there are disturbances in the habitat, you'll see changes in behavior or the absence of those birds. And I was seeing in real time what can happen. And fortunately, these were temporary conditions. But I have learned that certain birds like, or they will only go to certain habitats. So I could not transplant an endangered ground hornbill that's going to possibly go extinct if he's studying that in Mozambique. But you cannot take these birds and put them in a different habitat. It's very specific. And so specific that I would have certain birds I would see on one side of the yard where the oak trees were, and other kinds of birds on the other side where it was mostly floral, flowers, meadow-like. And like the yellow rump warbler was only in a particular tree, a myrtle tree. So that led me to realize that everything is connected in that way. People talk about that. If there are no insects, birds don't have insects to eat. But when you're there every day watching these birds and what they do, and you realize, gosh, if I even just take that one tree away, I'd probably lose that yellow rump warbler.
Right.
Because that's the tree that it likes. So any change, I became very aware that the whole nature of what conservation is about, it's not just about the birds, it's the habitat.
Yeah. During my master's work at Cal State Los Angeles, I studied the urbanization process at the broad scale, at the citywide scale, trying to answer this question of how does habitat change affect breeding bird occupancy? And what you see is exactly what you're describing in your backyard. You take away the tree, or perhaps you add a tree. There's some change in the physical structure and biological structure of the yard, and you see changes in the bird life.
Yeah.
And the same thing happens at the citywide scale.
Yeah.
And so what you're describing in terms of this, this sense of needing to preserve the type of habitat that a certain bird uses is really crucial in a broader sense when we think of how to live well in cities. And now we have over 55% of the global population living in cities. And that's going to continue to grow to about 75% in the next 30 years. And so we're in this really kind of striking urbanization period. And that's where setting aside some habitat for a habitat specialist to use, like maybe a bird that needs meadow, it's not going to do well in a city environment with lots of trees,
And it's true, it's so specialized. Every now and then I would get a bird that was, we call them one-offs because you're really not supposed to see them in your particular yard because of what you have there. So it'd be like a western meadowlark.
Sure.
Which needs these big open meadows. I mean, it's going to sing operatically too, and you'd see those, and invariably it'd be a juvenile bird, a very young, inexperienced bird who just was exploring outside of its usual habitat, and it would come and sit in the hoop net and eat seeds for a while, and then take off. So many things to learn about birds. They open up your sense of what's going on. So you can very quickly extrapolate how global warming would affect, if it's going to affect one species among 10,000 in the world. Imagine also other animals and people. They're almost like the gateway to a lot of understanding about our world and what's at danger, what's in peril.
Yeah, I think what you've done with this book is really remarkable because it is using birds as this gateway into a broader understanding of our world and our interaction with it through the backyard context. Just in the way that I think some of your other books have done the same thing, but into an emotional and relational world and into a cultural landscape. And so I think that what you've done is just in some ways so different from other books that you've written, and in some ways is continuing in this invitation to your readers to enter into understanding the world.
I have to say, first off, also, that I am not an expert. You'll see that's evident in the beginning of the book, that I'm a very naive person who's not really watched birds that much. I see this behavior, I'm asking about it. I want to do some simple things like the Dr. Dolittle effect, where you have a bird come to you, those kinds of things, where you have a natural tendency to look at birds as cute and you want to draw them. And it was It wasn't until over time that I began to learn more and more about birds, and then eventually falling in love with them. You should know also these field sketches, what I call field sketches, they were dining room sketches, looking at the birds that were in front of me 10 feet away. So I'm in a house that was built to look kind of like an airy, you know, where there's windows that open completely on two sides. The birds can fly through, and they sometimes did. But so these birds are about 10 feet away, and I could do these field sketches, plen art we call it, and then put down my observations of what these birds were doing with a lot of questions. I think that's a feature in this book, is a lot of questions. That is the nature of nature journaling, too. It's not that you know anything. You're not trying to say this bird is 9 inches long. You're saying, why is this bird doing this? Why did it go over? Now, is this bird going to win this food? Is it because it's bigger, or it has more aggression in it? Or, you know, you just keep asking the questions. And the more questions you ask, it leads you down this path to keep observing all kinds of things. And it's what I think scientists do naturally as well, only I'm not disciplined. I don't have to look at one bird and what it does in a very organized way. I have the joy of simply looking and asking the questions for myself, and then continuing to observe. The observation is enough for me.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. Thinking of these sketches, we have some slides to take a look at some of the sketches that you've done and some of the birds that have come to your yard. So I wonder if we could just take a moment to look at these excellent avian inhabitants of Sausalito, California. Yeah, what would you like to reflect on as we see these?
Just really quickly, the first one is a fledgling scrub jay, giving a flirtatious look. There is a male Anna's hummingbird. You see that that color on the bird when it turns, and it's a refraction quality that is built in the structure of the feathers. And that's a bird that I didn't know what it was for a while until I saw a parent feed it. It is a dark-eyed junco fledgling, brand new fledgling. And its coloration, a lot of these very young birds look very different from the adult plumage they'll eventually get. And then that is my favorite bird, a great horned owl. And it's my favorite not just because it's big and it's hard to find for most people. It's because it cleared all of the rats in my neighbor's ivy. 2 of them, in fact. There were 2 of them, a mother and a son. The son was young. He still kind of had a white head. And the mother was teaching him how to hunt. And he was very successful, because we must have had 1,000 rats in the ivy. And they would go, across our patio. We'd see them throughout the day. And then at night, it was like they were running a marathon at night. Hordes of them running across. So, if you have rats, if you have a pest, you know how difficult it is. And you're really tempted to use poison. No, because that would kill something like a great horned owl that eats rats that have been poisoned. So I had to think about what I'd do, and I didn't have to think about it because the owls moved in and lived there for 8 months.
Fantastic.
Yeah, didn't have to pay them.
Yeah. Wonderful.
Okay, so there's one thing I want to just say about these photos, which I took. All the birds that I write about in here are birds in my yard. All of the drawings are birds in my yard. These are birds in my yard, and they were all photos I took. And that's important, because if I draw a bird and I use somebody else's photo, I do have to give them credit for that photo as my reference photo. So I use my own. But there's something these birds have in common, and I wondered if you can see what it might be. 5 seconds. 3, 2, 1. Okay, the common thing is they're all looking at me. Okay? And that was important, because that look at me was what I was describing, that now you have a relationship. Look how endearing they are. They're looking at me, and they're not scared. They just continue to stay there. So that's what I love about looking at birds and the fact they're looking at me. And again, you see, there's a very young fledgling oak titmouse at the very top, a male Townsend's warbler who will get a new name soon. They're changing all the eponymous names. A California quail, a male, little pygmy nuthatches that are one of the most numerous birds I have now, except for the golden-crowned sparrows, which is that bird at the bottom in the, the big head. They're migrants, and so they leave in April. The spotted towhee with the fierce face, he always seems to look at me that way, no matter where. I would go and brush my teeth in the morning, and I'd see this. It would look like that, So, and then that's a hermit thrush and a California towhee. Some of the things that I read in the Cornell ornithology page, we who don't know much about birds, we would go to these pages to learn what these birds do. And I would look at also Facebook groups, like what does this bird do? And Cornell said the hermit thrush is very shy, reclusive, won't come out to feeders. And I thought to myself, being an amateur and a rebellious person who made her mother miserable, I thought, well, why? Why is it that it wouldn't, why is it secretive? Why is it more secretive than others? Why won't it go to the feeder? Is its feet built, are their feet built in a certain way that they can't perch? Is it because they're used to be on the ground to protect themselves? I didn't know, but I thought I'd do an experiment, and that is, I built these cages, and I put them on the ground. They're ground feeders. And then I raised the feeder up a little, and then I raised it even higher, and then I hung it with the rest of the feeders, and they were still going in the cages. Okay, so Cornell, Facebook page, no. Of course, these observations are very individual. They're just one person looking at it. A very scientific-minded person like Sean would do extensive research to see exactly what's going on there. But I do think the structure of their feet probably have a lot to do with it, that they don't perch. Right. They can go into feeders that don't require, I've seen them perch as well. The sparrows, the little ones. I had somebody on Facebook, I would go there and ask information like, what does this dark-eyed junco eat? I just discovered I had this cute little bird called the dark-eyed junco. And this person, a woman on the Facebook page, said, you really ought to buy a guidebook on birds before you ask questions like this. It was like a virtual slap. And I was, kind of, oh my God, that was the stupidest question to ask. And she said, they're ground feeders. They don't eat from feeders. They're not going to eat anything that you put out there. Oh, okay. But then again, it's like, why? Why? I mean, they have little feet, but they're sparrows, they're ground feeders. So I did the same thing. And it was really out of spite that I did the experiment. I have to admit, it was like to the poobah on Facebook. No, you're wrong. It loves suet. It loves seeds. It loves worms, live mealworms.
Yeah, wonderful. And here now are some of the sketches of these birds that you have seen in your yard, including that dark-eyed junco up in the top center, the California towhee on the right, the fox sparrow in the lower center, and that young fledgling dark-eyed junco in the upper left.
These are detailed drawings of individual birds, and again, for me, they are not illustrations for a guidebook on species, and that's because the guidebooks have to show all the features, what they call field marks, for identification, and these all have to show up in particular species. So this is me representing a bird that I saw that I just loved. It looked at me. I said, I'll do your sketch, do your portrait, and I would use colored pencils and do these every single feather. It was my chance to think about them. And the guy who taught me to draw birds and to do nature journaling had recommended that when you look at a bird, to capture a bird, you should imagine feeling the bird. You should imagine the life force of the bird. And being a fiction writer, I could just take it one step farther, and I became the bird. So I would be doing this, imagining myself as I'm drawing the bird, that I am the bird now, and what every single part of the bird felt like, but what it does for the bird. They're not all anatomically correct. I mean, these birds were drawn at different stages of my learning about birds, so the plumage is not always right. These birds would not fly that well. But it was really more to capture a meditative feel about birds. And I do think a lot of bird watchers, bird lovers, end up looking at birds and feeling a kind of calm, meditative aspect. That is the joy that birds bring to a lot of us. You know, I want to bring up this point we talked about, which is the difference between birding and bird watching. There are many ways to bird watch and bird, and I think that many people think that if you bird, you should know the names of 1,000 birds. Well, there are only, 900 species in the States, so you only need to know 900 species and what they look like, so that when you see it in a tree 100 feet away, you can say, oh, there it is, you know, the hermit thrush. Actually, it would be on the ground, the hermit thrush. But no, you don't have to do that. I couldn't do that. I thought a scrub jay was a blue jay, and they don't exist in California. But it didn't stop my appreciation of watching this bird. So I will say this, that if you want to get into birds, don't worry about that stuff. Speed birding is not what many of us like to do. You don't like to speed bird, I don't like to speed bird, you know, where people call out the names and mark a list and they go on. I like the kind of birding where you are just sitting there for hours looking, and for you years, looking at the same bird in very concentrated ways. And that's where I think people get the joy of the birds, because you see these individuals coming back every day, and they become part of your yard and part of your life.
Yeah. It strikes me also that one of the differences between this idea of speed birding, going out, trying to see as many species as possible in as short a period of time as possible, and the distinction between that and sitting, meditating on an individual bird, looking at its expression, looking at you, looking at it goes back to what it's doing. It reveals a different thing about the environment. When you're going out and trying to survey birds as quickly as possible and as extensively as possible, it's a great picture of biodiversity in that location. And that has its own value. And then on the other hand, you have these behavioral observations that are an individual bird or a set of individuals responding to the environment that they're in. And so each has its place, but I think that for many people, the joy comes through really getting to know the individuals, and you bring them to life so fully.
I think it's the curiosity aspect, which anybody can have. And you know, you were just talking about if you change the habitat, that the birds behave differently, they interact differently. Well, I did change the habitat a lot, and that was because I would move the feeders. I would take a feeder off of one hanging shepherd's hook and put it somewhere else. And I would see that the birds would go back to the same place where that feeder had been repeatedly. They might discover that there was a feeder in a new location, but they treated it, it seemed to me, as a new feeder. They would use that and then they would keep going back to that. And I thought, how interesting that that little change affects this behavior, its cognition of what it recognizes as the place where the food is. So those are the little experiments you can do to torture birds without killing them and get some interesting results, you know, and just seeing, you get to learn a lot about what birds are like and what they do.
Yeah, you see the ways that they are faithful to a site that is providing a resource for them. Many birds have site fidelity for nesting locations, and they'll return maybe to the same yard to breed year after year, despite having migrated to Venezuela and back. And then other birds that say, oh, I know where this resource is. I know that Amy Tan's yard has the best suet in all of Sausalito.
Yes, exactly.
And they won't hesitate
the best jelly ever.
Right.
Now, how do people know that the birds come back to the same place when they're wintering in a warmer climate like California? Is it the banding on the bird legs that let people know that the birds have, or is there anything? I've discovered something, but I was curious. Is there research about that?
There is.
You see the same birds coming back to your yard, and you welcome them, but you think, is it the same bird?
Yeah, is it the same individual, or is it another individual of the same species, recognizing that this is good habitat?
Yeah.
So the very earliest record of a bird migrating between continents was in the late 1800s. A bird traveled from, early 1800s. It was a stork, a white stork, that traveled from Africa to Europe with a spear embedded in its chest.
Okay.
And when it arrived in Europe, people said the only place where these spears are made is in Western Africa.
Okay.
And so that was the first direct knowledge that this individual had traveled across continents. And then after that, people started saying, okay, let's figure out how we can do this more broadly and with less spears involved.
Yeah.
And so they started putting metal wire on birds' legs. And then they realized, oh, we can create standardized bands that have unique numbers, and we can look at individual birds.
Yeah.
So,
have you seen these wild birds with bands on their legs? If you actually take a photo and you can see the numbers, you can report it, and that information is very useful to people who are studying these birds that are banded. But I found out that the birds were coming back to my yard year after year, or God knows how many years, because they may not live more than 6 or 7 years, if that's a long lifespan.
For something like a warbler
sparrow.
or a sparrow, absolutely.
And they live in their turf where they nest is Alaska or northern Canada, so they have to come a long ways. You have to keep in mind also that about, correct me if I'm wrong, 75% of a lot of songbirds do not make it to adulthood. So you're looking at an individual who's made it all the way to adulthood and has been to Alaskans, coming back to Amy's Deli. I have the green roof, it says turn left here, good suet down there, and I would always have the best food available. But the way that I knew they were the same birds is that I built these cages with the grid and the 1.5-inch openings, like four panels, and one on top and one on the bottom. And some of these golden crowned sparrows would fly right in. And some of them that were it was their first winter birth, they would be on the outside trying to figure out how to get in. They were young birds who had never seen these cages before, and they would figure it out after a while, and maybe they would come back later as an adult breeding bird, and fly into the cage. But that's what I would notice, that half of the birds knew how to get into the cage.
It's remarkable, right?
Yeah.
This ability for a bird to be able to recall where to find food and also how to access that food after migrating hundreds of miles and migrating back.
And there's weather involved, they could be blown off course, and they're miracles. When I think of birds now and I look at them, I think of all of them as miracles. The fact that they survived all these different, challenges in the environment or predators and whatever, and that, they're there. But what they have gone through, each one of them, if you knew that, you'd think it's a miracle that they're there.
Each of these individuals that has traveled so far and experienced so many different environments, it comes back and it may look like the same bird, but it has built this life experience. And it's a great, I think, parallel to how humans age this aggregation of experiences over time. And maybe we see someone who we haven't seen in a long time and say, oh, you look just like you did back in the day.
Ha ha.
Yeah.
Sure.
It's always a lie.
Yeah.
But in the interim, they have gained all sorts of experiences and perspectives that we have no way of accessing. You know, that even if we ask questions and detailed questions and engage in enduring conversations with them, there will always be some way that they have changed that is inexpressible. And I think that birds can lead us into that way of seeing human relationships in this enriched light.
Yeah. I ended up, you know, when part of the meditation was to get some peace of mind, because I started doing this in 2016 when there was a lot of divisiveness and open racism also to Asian Americans, and I was so disturbed by it I needed to find peace, and so I started sketching and looking at birds and things. But I forgot what your remark was. I was going off in a different tangent. I was going to connect it to what you said, and I forgot what our theme was that we were talking about. But anyway, the quality of being in the yard also leads to other aspects, like this curiosity, this knowledge, this understanding of what birds must do. And it also led me to have questions about mortality, being very aware of the fact that these birds are all about survival and that many of them don't survive. There's a certain attrition rate over the years. Whether this is the same bird that I saw before, how old is this bird? And I also came across questions of morality watching these birds. And part of it had to do with something I very much need when I write fiction, and that is compassion, sympathy, identification with my characters. I would see these birds, and of course I feel very tender toward them, and but then I had to feed these birds. I absolutely had to feed the birds the live mealworms, because they had nestlings and they were having a hard time getting food back and forth. So I put out these live mealworms, and they're live, they're moving, and I had to pick up these handfuls of birds. I would get 20,000 at a time because they eat a lot, like about 1,000 a day. And then 20,000 mealworms don't fit that well in the refrigerator, and eventually I have a very understanding husband. We've been together for 54 years, and one of the reasons why is that he doesn't complain about mealworms in the refrigerator. We end up buying a new refrigerator, so just for the birds and the dogs. The dogs have a special food. But anyway, the mealworms became part of it, and I would see them, and it seemed to me like they knew they were going to die, because they were kind of frantic to get away. And then one day these yellow jackets came, and they were feeding all the live mealworms, like just crunching off a little bit here and there. And I thought, oh my God, they're really suffering. They're really writhing now. And so I got a yellow jacket trap with, you know, a little dog food and sugar and water. And the yellow jackets went in there, and suddenly they were trying to stay afloat. They were on the dog food, rolling around like on a log, and you could hear them buzzing, and then more of them would come, and it looked like, now I read that yellow jackets can recognize faces. Yep. So I'm thinking the yellow jackets is like, Betty, Betty, hold on, I'm gonna get to you pretty soon. And then I thought, well, who should I root for? Yeah. You know, the mealworms should be for the birds, you know, and there are all these different questions about the phylogenetically determined sympathy from a human. And was this wrong to partition my sympathy in the animal world? And there was this expression that I heard, I kept hearing all the time whenever you see a photo of a hawk that's taken a little cute bird, circle of life, you know. And I got tired of this phrase, because what it meant to me was, let's not feel bad for this creature that died. Circle of life. Now we can blunt ourselves and move on. Or people who would say, you know, if you can't take it, this is what they need to do. Hawks need to eat. A lot of them are starving, just like songbirds, so I don't begrudge them a meal. But I also believe, for me, that it is good for me to feel uncomfortable about the death of any animal. And even those mealworms, you know, you don't know at what level these animals feel pain, feel fear, if they have fear. If they're trying to get away, evade danger, they must have something akin to fear. And so again, looking at nature, it can bring up these questions. And those questions, I think, are good, because part of what, at least in my life, what's important to me is to feel deeper, more deeply every year. Feel deepness about everything in emotion, whatever I'm looking at. So these birds have contributed to that examination. You know, this question of morality and, you know, or, you know, worms. 20,000. They're expensive. Don't waste it, birds.
Yeah, and what is life if not a call into a deeper engagement with what is moral and what is good, and an attempt to step away from all the things that would callous us to that sensitivity, which is so much of life on this planet. We are trained to say no, to put up barriers, but then in the midst of even a global pandemic where we're watching the world seemingly fall apart around us, then birds can offer an opportunity to break down those walls, to say, how can I be not only more moral, more just and right in my interactions with these mealworms and the western bluebirds that are eating them, or with the yellow jackets and what they have going on, but also with the other people in my community, in the planet that I live on, and the people who are not yet born, but who will rely upon the world that we are inhabiting right now.
You know, you said to me, we said it a while ago, but it brought up this question I have of you. We talked about expressions, or I don't know if you said the word personalities, but people always say, oh, your drawings have this personality. And I thought, I had this question about bird expressions. Do they do anything with their faces that are like facial, like surprise or anger or irritation or love or?
Yes.
I mean, do they have that?
I'm
Have
delighted
you observed
that
that?
Yes.
In the face or in the body, but in the face.
Yeah. So it's worth saying right now.
See, this is the kind of thing you can watch for.
Yes.
If you do this kind of birding.
So much of human facial expression is around our mouth. You know, whether or not we're smiling, whether we're tight-lipped. Birds don't have that luxury, right? So they have these immobile, broadly immobile mouth parts, these beaks. And so you have to look to other parts of their faces to look for expressions. One of the main places to look is their eyes. So birds have pupils that they can dilate or contract at will. And they will use this as a way of expressing intrigue or arousal or fear. And they will use that dilation as a way of signaling to other birds how they are experiencing that moment. So you'll often see two birds as part of a mating ritual pinpoint their eyes and expose a lot more of the iris. And so the colorful parts of the eye become more apparent. Birds do also have facial feathers that they can move. So some birds will move feathers over the base of their beak when they're feeling contented. You can watch this in parakeets, you know, in pet cage birds, in cockatiels as well. You, on the other hand, have parrots, larger parrots like macaws that have lines, these tracts of feathers that have grown over their face that are individually identifiable. So it's like a fingerprint for that individual bird. And so they can recognize one another not only by the ways that they're changing their faces, but by actually the structure, and in some cases the coloration, the color patches on the bird's face as well.
So here's an observation I made, and I had a guess, and it may be wrong. I'm the amateur, I get to make a lot of guesses. So I would see these golden-crowned sparrows. They would do aggressive moves, and sometimes, because I created this artificial environment with the feeders, there would be a lot of interspecies and intraspecies aggression going on over the food. And I would see the golden-crowned sparrow, which has the adults in breeding plumage, they have very dark lateral crown stripes. They look like eyebrows, and they go, you know, right over the eye. And then they have very neon yellow crowns. And then the younger ones don't have that coloration quite as much. So I would see a very assertive adult golden crowned sparrow, and it seemed to me, when it looked at another one that was kind of the same, that its crown, the crest would rise, and that in doing it, it seemed like almost this little area, this is called the supercilium,
It is.
would rise up, which gave it that raised crest. Now that is a guess.
Yes.
So
Yes.
what is going on here? I got an expert here. I've been meaning to ask this question. It's in the book. I have this guess. Is this possible? And I filmed it in slow motion to actually watch what was going on. Okay, the expert answer?
The expert answer is yes. Birds are absolutely using these facial patterns, and especially their crests, as a way of showing dominance or aggression. Yeah.
And I think that almost all the birds can do something with their crests.
Yeah.
You know, people are always talking about the oak titmouse has a lot of these birds, but I see birds, there's a little, they do the shape shifting, their necks getting longer or whatever, but yeah, the crest.
And one of the species of birds in your backyard that features pretty prominently in this book and is even on the cover is Anna's hummingbird, which uses those the extended gorget, so those feathers underneath the throat, but also those crown feathers. It can position those feathers to reflect and refract the light in particular ways and at different times.
So it's not just the posture of the bird.
Right.
It actually can turn those feathers in a certain direction.
Yes, yeah, so it can fan them upward and outward, both on the crown and on the gorget.
Wow.
Yeah, and actually, you described display flights as well.
Yeah.
And one of the things that has been pretty extensively studied by a lab at Princeton University, Cassie Stoddard's lab, has looked at how this flight display and the angle at which the male is displaying to the female, which is coordinated with a sound, which is wind passing through the tail feathers of the male, is also timed to the millisecond with when that bird raises those feathers. So you could imagine a female hummingbird sitting on her perch, the male goes up on a display flight, comes down in this kind of fishhook shape, and just at the lower edge of that turn, the wind passes through those tail feathers, creates this kind of buzzing, snapping sound, and the bird squeaks, so you can often hear that vocal squeak at the same time, the male squeaks. And then the feathers on that male are providing this visual explosion. So you have movement, sound, and color all in this millisecond change. So that gives the female bird this kind of sensory experience that signals to her whether or not that male is going to be a good mate.
Let me tell you about the other thing I noticed about these hummingbirds, that the females get short shrift. Yeah. Whenever you are watching or you're looking at a TV show or looking at photos or drawings, it's always the male that is illustrated. And the thing is that the males, they do this flashy thing and they're going around and defending stuff. They're very dramatic. The females don't have a lot of that flashy red. They just have a little at their throat, a little duller colored. So people are just remarking how wonderful the male Anna's hummingbird is. They do the courtship, but the actual, here's romance for you. The female says, okay, she splays herself on a branch, 4 seconds, okay? It's over, and he's on to somebody else, okay? And he's a deadbeat dad. He does not help with the nests. He does not build the nests. He does not feed the nestlings. He does not feed the mate, the one-night stand or 4-second stand. And so I think female birds, hummingbirds, should get a lot more attention, a lot of credit for what they do.
I absolutely agree.
Yeah.
Yeah. It has been a pleasure talking with you, Amy. Thank you so much for sharing with us about the Backyard Bird Chronicles. You end this book in a really remarkable way, and it's what you mentioned earlier, which is these birds that You say the most special is the bird that pauses when it is eating, looks and acknowledges that you are there, and goes back to what it was doing. And as we close out our conversation tonight, I wonder if you could just share with us a little bit about what you see birds doing in a broader sense when we are not around, whether as a species or as individuals watching them. What is the magic of a bird going back to what it was doing after we've observed it?
The bird is missing me terribly. No, the bird, I think, is constantly doing what it needs to do before the end of the day. And that by the end of the day, it needs to have a certain amount of food. So I just imagine, of course, I know the amount of food because I give them the food. And by the way, my entire yard is landscape for birds, bees, and butterflies. So those who say you should plant and not use feeders, they have that, but they like fast food, so what can I say? What do I imagine at the end of the day, or what do I imagine when I walk away?
When you walk away.
Okay, when I walk away, they go back to doing exactly what they were doing. That don't miss me. I'm part of, just like there's a tree that is there, or but they do recognize that I am the person that brings the food. So they go into their certain areas where they are just roosting or whatever. Here's one thing that I do notice, though, is that they very much identify me as food, not to eat, but that I bring the food because there have been, when they see me in the house, I'm going to go exercise in the morning, they line up on the fence, and it's like a little miniature version of Alfred Hitchcock's The Birds. But because it's just the little pygmy nuthatches and not these crows, they're all there waiting. And when I step out, they start squeaking, and then they come to the cage. And sometimes they come right to the cage when I'm standing there. And when I'm not there, I think if there's no more food left, they just go back and they start hunting in their own, in the trees. I've seen them do that. They're looking under bark and that kind of thing. But what do you think they're doing?
Yeah. I think, you know...
Besides missing me.
Yeah, besides missing you, which is probably the predominant thing that they're doing, if you're so closely associated with food. I think I'm thinking in a broader timeline, and I think in kind of
about dinosaur-wise?
Well, just in kind of a planetary history sense.
Oh,
yeah.
Yes.
And the future of where we're going on this planet.
Yes. Well,
so,
they're so diverse.
Yeah.
So they can sustain themselves in different habitats. So you wipe out one habitat, the hornbills will take over. If, that's the habitat that's left.
Yeah.
It's like birds that are more flexible or more capable, like a house sparrow, of living in many different environments, eating many kinds of food, including, the junk food that gets dropped on the ground. It seems to me they have a greater chance of living and thriving in some way. And so to me, because of the many diverse species, and there's about 11,000 in the world?
10,886, yeah.
Yeah. Some guy just found his 10,000th bird, so that stuck in my mind, but he hadn't found all of them. But I didn't know the exact number. And so, you think about that there are all these birds in different habitats, and that what kind of bird would be able to survive in extreme conditions if something happens to Earth? Obviously, something happened when dinosaurs died off, and some of those birds some of those dinosaurs managed to, or the birds actually evolved even before, out of this same thing. So they were there, but there is this ability to change and evolve. And that's my opinion. When I see these birds, they seem very delicate, but yet because of the kind of specialized genetic structure, I think that, for one thing, they fly, that they're able to evade certain disasters and fly a long way. You have a nuclear fallout, you're not going to be able to run that far, but a bird can take off and fly thousands of miles. So.
Thank you. Thank you.
I have a question. There's so many birds in the world, and I rarely ever see a dead one. And I wonder, I've always wondered where they go. Last week I was walking in New York City, and I saw one on the sidewalk, and that's such a rare thing to happen. And I was wondering, maybe Amy also, if you've observed what happens at the end of their lives, but also Sean, if you're the expert.
Well, I can address the bird that you saw in New York. It probably was a window strike, because a lot of birds, thousands of birds, well, 1 billion birds a year probably die of window collisions. And in New York, you have so many tall buildings and reflective surfaces. They were monitoring, actually, a number of people with Audubon monitoring how many of these birds died of window collisions. The thing is, they would pick them up and take them away as well. So those birds are not going to sit out there for that long. I have seen dead birds. I have unfortunately had probably in the 12 years that I've lived there about 10 birds that hit the window or had a disease and died. And that was so tragic to me the first time I saw it. I decided for a while I would never have feeders again. I took them down. But then what I did was I tried to find a way to prevent them from hitting the windows. I have these wonderful view windows. I see the bay, I see Angel Island, and I covered the windows with spider webs. I drew those. I found a white water-based acrylic pen, and I developed a pattern that just covered all the windows. And I see the birds heading to the windows, and they put on their brakes and they stop. So it worked. That's, some people might think extreme, you know, but you just have to realize I'm crazy about these birds, and I cannot bear to see even one of them die. But I don't know what happens to birds that die of natural causes. There's so many, I mean, okay, 1 billion die every year from collisions, but 1 to 4 billion die from outdoor cats, predation by outdoor cats. Please encourage people, or if you have an outdoor cat, bells don't work because they're little nestlings on the ground and they can't run away from the bells. And a lot of them are the baby birds that get eaten. But I don't know what happens to why don't we see that?
Yeah, I think in part it's window strikes, massive challenge, especially in cities, very well documented in New York City and Chicago in particular, these cities along flyways. And in those environments, some of those birds are collected and become museum specimens. Others, end up being swept into dust bins and tossed out, which is a pretty tragic end for a long-distance migrant.
Now, would a hawk eat a dead bird?
In general, hawks don't eat dead birds. If it's a large hawk like a red-tailed hawk and a large bird like maybe a Canada goose, where the carcass is on the landscape long enough for the hawk to notice.
And it's Thanksgiving.
And it's Thanksgiving, so it's feeling festive. Then in some of those cases, a hawk might scavenge on carrion. But in terms of small birds, songbirds, when they die, especially if the bird's body is exposed, like on a sidewalk or in an open area, then other birds will often scavenge, and so you'll have crows, jays, those, and even gulls, seagulls will take window-killed birds. On the other hand, birds have been human food for since time immemorial, and that's because they're this really neat little package of nutrients. And so almost anything in the opportunity to consume a tidy meal is going to take advantage. So everything
Audubon did that.
From ants, yes, exactly. John James Audubon did that. Yeah. But so do colonies of ants and other scavenging insects, and then also small mammals too. So I think because it's this opportunity to suddenly have a meal right in front of you that doesn't require any work to consume, then you end up with those birds' bodies disappearing relatively quickly.
There you go.
Hi, how do you feel about museum collections of birds?
I am of two minds. One is that they serve an important scientific purpose, and I have visited a number of these collections, especially at Cal Academy in San Francisco, to see how they documented, for example, changes in beaks in what are known as Darwin's finches, each finch found on a particular island, and the fact that some of these finches are beginning to look more and more alike, and their food sources, seem to be the same. What does that have to do with survival? There's so many things that ornithologists like Sean do with that information. I have handed over any bird that I find that's dead, not just those who've died. People bring me dead birds because they know I put them in the freezer. Not just the worms in the fridge, but the birds, and then I take them when there's time to Cal Academy Department of Ornithology. But I'm also of the mind that, so they do have a great scientific purpose when we're studying many things that he can address. But there are some places that do collections, and they want to have the most number of a certain kind of bird, a very rare bird. So they'll go to these places, they find the bird, and they kill it. And they kill not just one specimen, they need to have several specimens in order to make this ID very, to confirm it in a way. And I hate those collections. I hate the people and their logic for doing it, because to me it's pride of ownership. It's not about studying the birds. So I don't know, you may have a different opinion.
I think that your first point about scientific value of museum collections is really key. That what you see in a museum, on the one hand, you're seeing if you're a visitor to the museum, you might see the exhibit that is mostly taxidermied birds. These are birds that have been mounted in lifelike positions to give you a sense of what this bird might look like in the wild. But behind the scenes of a museum, you have the research collections where you have many more individuals of many species that can offer you things like insights into how beak shapes change over time. Museum collections also have the really kind of important scientific value of giving us a sense of birds over time. So not looking at birds just in one place at one point in time, but maybe in that same place over decades or centuries. And so some of the really kind of amazing conservation success stories that we have in North America, like the return of peregrine falcons, come from the fact that we had peregrine falcon eggs in museum collections prior to the advent of DDT, and we could measure the thickness of those eggshells and then compare that to the birds during the DDT era that had thinning eggshells, and actually say, oh, because we knew what this specimen was like in the past, we can understand and we can actually demonstrate what is the driver of that thinning process. And so were those eggs not collected historically, we would never be able to do that and then move towards a world that has fewer toxins and that allows birds to thrive. And so I think at the individual level, you could look at that bird's egg being taken into the museum collection and say, what a loss. At a collective level, we can see enormous value. There are also, thankfully, a lot of safeguards in place to address point 2 that you just made, which are...
What happened to that collection?
So,
okay,
yeah,
so I think
safeguards. Right now, there's this conversation in museum science to try to address some concerns about how rare is a species and what is the ability for that population to withstand any kind of pressures. And that could be land use change, so the conversion of habitat into agriculture or into an urban environment. That could be invasive species like brown tree snakes on Guam, which have wiped out many endemic bird species that were only found on that island. It could be disease and the spread of disease in a global sense or in a local sense. So birds are facing a lot of other pressures far beyond museum collection efforts. And now there is this conversation about, what is appropriate, what is morally right to take for its scientific value. And that has really changed, even just in the past 10 years, how people have approached museum collections. And additionally, many museums are affiliated with universities where an institutional review board would have to go over the collection protocol before any birds are collected. So you have this checkpoint to say, is this being done correctly and carefully?
Well, I hope they use that checkpoint a little bit more assiduously with one collection in a university that I am aware of.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know, you probably know the one I'm talking about. Yeah.
I think,
it's
there's
very controversial.
a needed call for
Yes,
continued
for that one.
care. Yeah.
Just kind of backtracking to the earlier slide, are there certain features that birds express when they're in grief?
Have you seen this?
well,
You talk
yes,
actually
yeah.
right at the start of the book about
yeah.
death and dying with
Yeah,
pine siskins.
Yeah.
So
Well, that, you're talking about, do the birds express grief? I have found, okay, so one time I had a problem with crows being in the yard and eating a lot of the food and scaring away the songbirds and bringing their kids over and knocking the feeders to get seeds. And I thought, how do I get rid of crows without killing them? And so I read that crows recognize themselves, but they will also mourn fallen comrades. And they, have group mourning. So I thought, okay, what should I do here? I went to the Wild Birds Unlimited store and I bought a $14 crow that was fake, okay? It had chicken feathers or something on. I mussed it up, I hung it upside down, and sure enough, some crows went by and, they recognized it. So they said, how could they recognize a fake crow? I mean, okay, so the word went out, and I don't know how this happens. It happens really quickly. Two birds scouting see the dead bird, and suddenly, within minutes it seems, there are hordes of crows coming from all four directions, not just one direction that the scout crows came from, all four directions, and they're all screaming, and they go in the tree, and they scream and scream. Maybe they're not mourning. Maybe they're saying, who's playing this practical joke on us? I don't know, but I got rid of them. They did come back after that, and so who knows what it is. Yeah. It was, a little mean, but I didn't hurt them.
yeah, just cause psychological damage.
Psychological damage,
Yeah,
especially with the young ones who could see that could happen to them. Yeah.
Yeah, I think in terms of facial expressions, you don't see much in terms of birds with grief, but certainly behavioral changes.
Screaming, a lot of screaming.
Yeah, vocal and behavioral changes you do see.
Yeah.
And this includes birds that have lost a mate, where they maybe stay around the nest site for prolonged periods of time, waiting for that mate to return. You see
Do
this
they sing for the mate?
In some cases, for birds, they will be calling, using a contact call that the mate would recognize. Yeah. In other cases, you have seabirds that are faithful to an individual mate, like albatross. They fly out over long distances of open ocean. They return to the island or the cliffside where they were nesting, and they wait for their mate to return. And during the time that they're feeding and not breeding, then they may separate by thousands of miles over open ocean. They are not staying together during that time. And when they come back and they wait for that mate to return, they may lose a whole breeding season continuing to wait and wait, even when that mate may have met an unfortunate end. On the other hand, birds also show remarkable resilience and the ability to recover their love life after after the loss of a mate.
Yeah.
And so many of the birds that we think of as mating for life, if a mate does die, or actually also in some cases if a mate is infertile, then they will change mates, and the two birds will part ways, and then an additional mate will come along. So you do see these behavioral changes, but they do reach a point where in many species the bird will say, that mate is gone, and I need to take a different approach.
And our final question comes online. Somebody says, please ask Amy, now that she's done all this research on birds and birding, what is the likelihood that birds or birding will work their way into a novel?
Oh, never. No, not at all. Actually, that is a question I have, because they are such an obsession of mine. Books are an obsession as well. I mean, writing a story involves that same kind of obsessing over all kinds of details. So it naturally dovetails, I think. I don't know what part birds would have in my story. if I were to change a character, it would mean changing a lot of things to have this person now be a bird watcher, a bird lover, a bird anything. So it remains an open possibility. I definitely have thought of that. And if it's not a character, if it's not a main part of the story, there will be something in there. It'll be like, where's Waldo? You all will recognize where it is, what it is. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Amy. Thank you, Sean.